Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Glad you're here today. We're talking about emerging threats in remote access security. I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia from Conversational Geek. Now, the session today is going to rely on RealVNC's latest research. It's built from a survey of over 300 IT professionals across various industries, roles, organization sizes, and so on. And you will, of course, receive a copy of the full report by email in a couple of days, so don't worry about that. The findings specifically are focusing in on remote access security landscapes and what the complexities are, the operational difficulties that are existing, and so on. And we want to talk about today around some of these different aspects around this issue of remote access security and talk about the confidence that organizations have, what challenges they're facing, and so on. Now, I am joined today by three speakers. First up, we have Anthony Porter. Anthony's the Senior Security Architect at CSA Cyber. Anthony, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Nick. Yeah, thanks for having me back. Appreciate it. Second time around.
Glad that you're here as well. So I'm also joined by Oskar Grainger. Oskar is the Cybersecurity Engineer at RealVNC. Oskar, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Nick. I'm glad to be here. Yeah, cheers.
Glad you're here as well. And then we have Anton Zdziebczok. I'm always going to try and get your name right. I always get it about 90% there, but I'm trying. He is VP of Product at RealVNC. Anton, thank you for joining us as well. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Nick. You did a great job. That's pretty good. I'm not going to complain.
Pretty good. Top not bad for someone who doesn't know what it is. Exactly. Now, before we get started, just for those in the audience that don't know who the three of you are, could I have you each kind of talk, maybe take a minute or so, maybe even 30 seconds, just talk about your role at your respective companies. And Anthony, could I have you start?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everyone. Yeah, Anthony, Senior Security Architect here at CSA Cyber. So we specialize in supporting organizations via private sector, public sector, various places to secure their organization from the top down and also from the bottom up. So my role inside that is looking at advising senior board levels, but also getting into the code, looking at operational builds, looking at how applications are installed, what the configuration gaps are, and how we can support securing all the different organizations.
Wonderful. Glad to have you here. Oskar.
Yeah, hi, I'm Oskar. I'm the Cybersecurity Engineer at RealVNC. Typically, my day-to-day involves making sure that we at RealVNC are secure and improving sort of internal security practices, architecting new sort of systems and implementing any sort of security-related changes, and also a bit of incident response on the side.
Excellent. And Anton.
Thanks, Nick. I guess my job, I would sum it up as reading the tea leaves. So it's my job to help the organization understand like what is happening in the remote access market, what our customers want and need out of us, both today and going forward. And increasingly, my role is thinking about what impact AI is, not might, is going to have in the remote access industry, and how do we help keep our customers, in line to make the best benefit of that without risking their setups and making sure they remain secure.
Awesome. Glad to have all three of you. For those of you who are watching, of course, we're going to take a look at the findings from the report today. Some of them, not all of them, discuss what they mean, and then we'll have some Q&A time at the very end. So please drop your questions into the Q&A as we go. There's a chat and a Q&A. We'll look at both, but if you can, get yourself to go over to the Q&A and put it in there, that'd be more helpful. We would appreciate that very much. So we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation today. Let me jump over just onto this slide to show you here. Today's presentation is all about this report of the emerging threats in remote access security. We surveyed over 300 IT professionals, 323 of them, found 5 major themes here. The first one is that the threat landscape is shifting quickly. Phishing, ransomware, AI-driven attacks, those top the list. We'll delve into that a little bit here. Second, there's a clear confidence paradox where organizations feel secure, but there's still threats and attacks happening. Third, there's a gap between what organizations say they need in security and what they're actually implementing. Fourth, that the day-to-day work of managing security challenges often prevents teams from actually improving their defenses. And then finally, when we look at about 3 years out, asking organizations what their confidence level is, they feel less confident than they do today about the future. And so before we jump into any of the specifics here, just thinking about this at a high level, I have a couple of questions. Anthony, I'm going to start with you. You've looked at the report, and even though we haven't delved into the details yet, and just I've named these 5 themes here, what stands out to you most in the report? What's the maybe the clearest signal that IT leaders should be acting on right now as they just, I'm trying to get some input from the three of you. So as we go into this report, we've given the audience a little bit of fodder to be thinking about proactively. So what stands out to you most in the report?
Yeah, sure. So for me, it's one of the first statistics that I think we're going to go through in just a moment is that confidence level that you just mentioned. So we've got IT professionals that are feeling very confident they're secure. However, a lot of them, and it's almost the majority, are having incidents. So I think organizations, it's almost inevitable these days. It feels like that a breach is going to occur. So it's more of an assurance problem now we've got. So we haven't got a tooling problem. We don't have an estate issue as such. We've got controls, but do those controls actually work? Have we provided those via a tick box exercise? As an example, you need MFA. We ticked it. Yes, we've implemented MFA, but are there bypass mechanisms? Are there other ways that people are accessing, etc.? So it's less of we don't have enough controls. It's more of okay, do they actually work in the real world? Have you got visibility of what the paths are around them, etc.?
Good, awesome. I can't wait to talk. We'll talk about that in just a slide or two. That'd be great. Oskar, from your perspective, what does the report say about how organizations are currently judging the remote access security? Maybe the caveat to that be, where do you think that they assume they're better than they're really doing?
It seems that there's sort of a fixation on the amount of tools that people are using in their organization. More tools can sometimes sound better, but not necessarily the case, because there are challenges that come with that. So there's that, and then also probably a visibility issue. It seems that we'll talk about it, I'm sure, but a lot more senior level positions are more confident in their controls, and that seems to be the reverse when it comes to sort of like the sysadmins.
Bit of a disconnect there. We'll talk about that some as well. And then Anton, just from your perspective, what does the report reveal around that gap between how organizations operate remote access today and maybe what they need to be doing differently tomorrow, as we're going to talk about, for example, how AI starts reshaping support, diagnostics, service delivery. What's your thought here to plant the seed in the audience's mind before we jump into the report?
Yeah, I think that confidence gap that exists between the perceived state versus the implied state from incidents that happen, I think that metric is going to change pretty rapidly when you start thinking about the reality of what AI remote access might be. Like, there's a big difference between today, when we think about managing secure remote access, our fixation is who has access to what device. And that works with humans because most humans, you can understand their intent. They operate in a relatively, consistent and reasonable manner. It's not always the same when you think about AI agents, right? Their propensity to hallucinate, their desire that once they're given a task, they're sometimes, unstoppable, sometimes in their ability to do that, and might even come up with really creative ways to do things that you might not want them to do. And so we're going to end up evolving, in my opinion, from this concept of like remote access control to remote action control, where your controls have to be much more granular and fine-grained than they are today. It's less about like which machine can an agent touch and what's that agent allowed to do on that machine to quite a granular level. And so I think that confidence paradox is just going to get reflected even more when incidents stop being just like security incidents and start to become reliability incidents, or I don't know what term we're going to give these things, where like an AI goes off and does something maybe you don't quite expect it to do. I think that gap is only going to increase as we deal with some of the nuances around giving agents access to remote machines and what that's going to look like for the future.
Can't wait to dive into that. I've actually got about 4 or 5 questions for all three of you, just on AI, and a couple of slides here, because I really want to dive into that topic here. So let's start with the threat landscape. And for those of you watching, this is a little bit of a snippet from the report. We're trying to give you some of the insights from the report, but not everything in there. So obviously it's still worthwhile reading the report. And this question was really around where are the concerns that organizations are feeling when it comes to cyber threats. And if you look here, yes, there's a span of somewhere around 14%, 41% on the lower left and 55% on the lower right. But by and large, it's sort of generally speaking, these organizations are revolving around the same level of concern here. And you see ransomware, You see the lowest one being insider threats, which typically is there. It should actually be a little higher because inevitably an external threat actor will leverage internal authentication, internal credentials, and look like an insider. So I think that number should be a little higher in terms of just being worried about it. But then you also see like phishing attacks, which of course has been by and large the primary initial attack vector into organizations. And then there's this fear of AI-driven attacks here. And then on the other question here that was asked of them was just when thinking about remote access security specifically. So the left is all about just what are you worried about as far as incidents are concerned. On the right, we're talking about remote access security, and you see the sophistication of the cyber criminals and what are they able to do. And then again, the use of AI-driven attacks. And Anthony, I'm going to start with you as we sort of talk through this data a little bit and just provide some commentary. Things like phishing and ransomware, that's all very familiar. We've been seeing those for a long time. That might also lend itself to some of the confidence levels we'll talk about in another slide or two here. But AI-driven attacks obviously are sitting at almost the same level as these very common, experienced attack methodologies here. So what changes for defenders, for the organization that's defending themselves? What has to change for them when attackers use AI to discover weaknesses, to develop and run campaigns faster? What do they need to be doing differently in general?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think breaking down some of the fears around AI is going to exacerbate everything. What we're finding is AI is delivering things quicker. It might be lowering the barrier to entry for attackers, but it's not producing anything that didn't potentially exist a few years ago with somebody that had more time and more expertise on their hands. So what we're finding is the defenders and various organizations and individuals, we've now got a much quicker time from exposure to an exploitation. We're seeing 0 days be harvested within hours as opposed to a few days. And I think I saw a graph about it's about 5 years ago, you were talking months before an attack was actually rationalized and went through, whereas now we're talking hours. So the difference between how we are responding is the biggest impact, as opposed to trying to front load a load more security, try and throw more tools at the problem, try and fix everything up front. It's how effective are we at responding to these incidents now? How good is our detection? How good is our protection of our environment? So is there backups for your defenders? Can we willingly turn things off? Can we realize what someone's going to do? Where are they going to go if they expose X area and things along those lines? We need to assume that attackers are going to get in, or they're going to find a path in, or they're going to use AI to navigate themselves around. But how quick can we compress those? How quick can we protect ourselves? And it's more about that now, as opposed to thinking it's a new type of attack AI. AI is just a faster version of what we've always had.
So that's a great point. I always like to point out to IT professionals that are listening when we're talking on webinars and so on, is remember that the attacks are limited in scope by the environment they're attacking. So your point is spot on. There's only so many things even AI can do because, oh, it's Windows or it's Linux or it's whatever the case is it's interacting with. That's the part where it starts minimizing it down. So great point. I love that. Oskar, there in the report, it's not on the screen, but in the report, there's another stat that's where 71% of the organizations said that a vendor's security track record was kind of critical to them. And that makes sense. We've heard a lot about supply chain attacks and worrying about those kinds of things. And so the question I have, this is sort of just a vendor neutral question at a high level, but at the same time, I recognize you work for a vendor and that's okay. But it's just in this accelerated threat environment that Anthony's talking about here, how should buyers be thinking differently about vendor selection, both specific to remote access, because that's the topic today, but also just in general for any kind of vendor. And when we think about it from a security perspective, how should they be thinking differently about vendor selection?
In general, I think companies should really be looking at sort of what have they been publishing to the public and also behind sort of trust centers about potentially what they're doing actively to make sure that their systems are safe. So this could be security sort of white papers on their product, or pen test reports and how they've improved on that. Obviously, because your vendors can potentially have real impact to your critical systems, just like remote access softwares. So you really need to be looking for those really important sort of certifications these days. So things like your SOC 2 or your ISO 27001, they're good ways to make sure that you're finding a vendor who takes things seriously. There are plenty of other certifications out there, and I think vendors are going to be under more scrutiny as we go forward. Supply chain is definitely one of the big risks in the last few years. We're seeing it all the time nowadays.
And I want to explore that even a little bit more. Just talking about the idea of the supply chain being vulnerable, because if their platforms aren't secure, their software isn't secure, whatever the case is, that becomes an issue. And we saw recently Anthropic released the Mythos model. Well, it was a limited release where they allowed it to be accessed by security vendors so they could go and find their own vulnerabilities. It had found hundreds and hundreds of vulnerabilities in a very short period. I think it was 6 days, if I remember correctly. I might be wrong on that. But I want to talk a little bit about Mythos, and maybe in a larger perspective, the idea of AI being able to autonomously identify exploitable weaknesses. Now, on the good side, we have Mythos helping the good guys figure those things out before it's released to the general public. But maybe, Anthony, maybe I can start with you. Maybe you could break down for the audience, just in case they're not all familiar here with Mythos, if you could talk about what Mythos is, how is it actually being used to identify vulnerabilities, how it's different from traditional vulnerability scanning, and so on. Could you just walk through that for the audience?
Yeah, so just I'll cover the second part of the question first around what is the difference. So I think with traditional vulnerability scanning, they're looking for issues that are already known. They're looking for the kind of traditional CVE scores and patches that they would be expecting to see, etc. Things that an organization can go and fix fairly readily because there's information out there. They know about them, so they're searching their estate. The difference with tools like Mythos, and there's going to be plenty of other AI tools, I believe, they're going to do the same thing, and not all of them we're going to know about, which is, I guess, the bit that produces that fear on your slide there. It's looking through code bases more detailed. It's trawling through paths that traditionally vulnerability scanners weren't looking for. It's being able to jump through the hoops that what a human, say, would do, but that a scanner can't do. So Mythos is proving those in real time. It's going, okay, if I go from step A to step B, who blocks me there? What's the security protocol? Oh, it's okay. I can now move on to step C, etc. And it's going through that motion of, right, we've got risk management here, but it can do different things, and it's finding what is unknown, or what the security organizations that have used it, what they believed was unknown, because it's one code base from 1,000 different areas, and that Mythos is jumping between all of them. So it's less of a now thinking, we're fully patched and we're okay. If Mythos comes in, it will find, yes, you might be fully patched to the known CVEs or known vulnerabilities, but the chances are you are not going to be fully patched or fully secure from what something like an AI is going to find. But I think it links back to the previous point I made, is this is something that a experienced malicious insider, malicious attacker would be able to also do, but it would be taking them weeks and months to rationalize these, whereas Mythos is doing it in a couple of hours.
And Anton, I'm thinking about from a product perspective, thinking about this rise of the use of autonomous AI, and thinking about it in the context of what Anthony just mentioned, sort of the misusing of it to find vulnerabilities and so on. How should that change the way the organizations think about remote access?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think before I touch specifically on kind of like remote access specifically, I think generally what it means is that as individuals responsible for keeping these systems safe, it's our jobs to become more proactive. I think generally speaking, cybersecurity, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, has been like quite a reactive industry. As Anthony was saying, CVEs come out, somebody attacks it, the the time from like disclosure to exploitation is rapid, right? Way quicker than it's ever been. And these tools like Mythos, not only, as Anthony points out, does it allow people to do stuff faster, it also gives them the free will to take more shots, if that makes sense. There's an expression that they talk about in American football, right? People taking shots down the field. And when you have a limited number of downs in which to move the ball forward, right, you can't risk too much there. Once you've got tools like Mythos and other large language models that can, in the space of an hour, do what a competent security exploiter might have done in the past in days, that enables you to explore way more routes than before. And so the likelihood of somebody being able to find a path forward isn't just because these tools are better, it's that increased speed allows them to try more attack vectors. So we as organizations have to become more proactive. There's tools out there like Watchtower and other tools that are about preemptive exposure management. So once something does get out there, how quickly can I understand that my system may or may not be affected? I think that's really important. Implicit and explicit, I guess, to remote access is that we have to think, as I kind of talked about earlier, we have to start thinking about bringing those levels of control down a step, and not just to who does have access to these things, what can they do on these devices, bring that access level more granular, move from the idea of securing remote control through to securing action control, what can be done on those remote devices. I think it's important to make sure that when you're talking about not necessarily autonomous AI as a threat actor, but autonomous AI within your system and protecting and preventing accidents or misuse occurring, it's important to make sure that your guardrails are separated from your agentic workflows. That's like a really important step. AI agents have become much better at following do not do this instructions, but they are imperfect at that because they're non-deterministic systems, generally speaking. And so they're not always going to follow instructions. So you've got to make sure that you've got an instruction and a control and a security guardrails that sit outside of the thing doing the thinking and suggesting the action to make sure any action that's undertaken by these devices fits within your risk parameters and profiles. I think that's really important. And I think auditability becomes it's always been important, especially as Oskar mentioned earlier. If you're ISO 27001 certified, or you're SOC 2, or you're doing something in manufacturing like IEC 62443, auditing has always been really important. It becomes exponentially more important when you've got AI taking action, because you don't have, you can't just go to Janet or Bob on the factory floor and ask them why they did that. The explainability of large language models is way harder to understand. So you have to have a much more robust and detailed audit trail so you can understand the chain of thought and the thinking as to why the agent did the thing it tried to do, so that next time you can have the right guardrails in place if it was able to do something it shouldn't do, or that you can reaffirm your training or set up your context for that workflow so that it better follows those instructions in the future. So, I would whittle it down to those sorts of things, like thinking about being more granular with your security controls, making sure that you're separating out the control layer from the thinking layer, and then making sure that your audit and records of what's happened are up to scratch, because those are the things you're going to need to prevent these things happening again in the future.
Those are excellent points. I think about that from a remote access perspective. And it's kind of interesting because you're really not talking about anything new under the sun. It's just about getting more focused on making sure that controls, processes, procedures, methods of monitoring and auditing, all that, just make sure it's in place, because we have an attacker that may be leveraging AI to do things more faster, multiple attacks rapidly and so on, with variation that are necessary in order to try and gain access. So I love that thinking, because it's sort of like, again, nothing new under the sun. But that brings me thinking to Oskar. I want to bring to you is, if there's an organization that's maybe using, let's say, an older remote access solution, maybe something that's open source VNC, maybe something that's legacy, in an environment where, any organization doesn't want to be attacked, but especially in sensitive environments where maybe there's regulatory constraints, or it's got a particular data set that's accessible and so on. Why is that especially risky now that they're utilizing, let's say, an older platform? And should they do something, let's say, now, before this becomes a crisis type of response?
Using older softwares or older open source softwares, especially if they're not maintained anymore, is a massive risk. Especially with all these, the new AI capabilities that we have now. Analyzing the code bases is obviously one thing you can do with open source software. And so they can find those vulnerabilities, those 0 days that we found, that we've been talking about so far. And with the older software, you're going to probably have more potentially. There's so much possibility for exploitation in those older pieces of software. Ultimately, hopefully, no one is running older software, but we know that's not true. So it comes down to your other mitigating controls, really. You should always be looking to isolate all those critical systems, especially in those sensitive environments, as much as possible. So you don't want to have those old legacy systems and softwares, those remote access solutions, exposed to things that they shouldn't have. That should be like at the top of your risk register in that case, to make sure that you don't have any unnecessary risk and expose your attack surface, really.
I think just to jump in there on Oskar's point as well, it's about how are we able to monitor those remote access solutions. So if you've got varying versions of them, or you've got potentially slightly older versions, things that you can't patch for whatever operational reason, like every organization has their own rationale, right? It's, can you monitor those still? If you can't, then that's the second big flag that goes on your risk register. If you can, how quickly can you shut them down? What are they? What's the route that they go through? What sort of technology are they the remote accessing into? And how of a critical path is that for your organization? And that's where you can then lead on from there with some of those decisions. And we're finding that's how we're influencing some of the more senior leaders. Is it's not just a checklist now that says, oh, you're running a legacy version of this, you need to patch at some point, because it feels like it's always at some point or it's on a roadmap. But it's also, okay, but we also can't monitor it, so we don't know who's accessing. We also don't know where that goes to in the second line. We don't know where you can then jump from there, etc. Especially with remote access, there's normally a server onto a server onto a server. And this is what Anton was mentioning around these AIs. They're opening as many doors as they possibly can as quickly as possible. Whereas before it would take somebody quite a while to find out what's the next server they can go to. They're now doing it within seconds. So it's all about, for us, there's quite a lot of monitoring conversations that are happening, which feels like we've gone back 5 years to talking about monitoring and SOC and SIEM and things, but it's precedent now that we can see those real time.
Yeah, and those kinds of conversations that you're talking about, you mentioned a little bit earlier just now, Anthony, the idea of going back to management and making recommendations. And Oskar, you talking about organizations, again, with recommendations of how to approach this. I think it's sort of really necessary. The next slide kind of transitions to this over, and this idea of organizations have a very high confidence in their own abilities, and yet these recommendations that you guys are talking about, in general, I mean, even though we're just talking kind of in passing here as topically, but the idea of trying to put in new controls, new methods of monitoring, Anthony, your point of going back to 5 years ago and some of the basic, we would say over here, basic blocking and tackling. To you, Anton's mentioning football metaphors. I'll use that again, basic blocking and tackling. So those are the things we need to be putting in place. And for those of you watching, if you take a look at the chart here on the right-hand side, the confidence gap that exists here is demonstrated in the report here by looking at, if you start with the top left, you have 2/3 of organizations that are very or extremely confident in their security. We rock. We are awesome. Nothing's getting in. At least 2/3 of them anyways, right? And then at the same time, though, go down to the bottom right for a moment. The people that were confident, half of them still had breaches. And then on top of that, half of organizations, 47% in the lower left, had some kind of incident in 24 months. Differentiating incident, meaning it could just be someone tried to gain access. Maybe initial access was attained, but they didn't move laterally and steal any data, et cetera, et cetera. But the 55% is they actually had a breach. And so this actually demonstrates to you that there is a gap. You have this 2/3 that are saying we are tremendous. Have you met our security? It's incredible. And then at the same time, they're actually being breached. They're having incidents. So there's a difference here, disparity that exists here. And Anthony, I'm going to start with you. What do you think is driving this gap between the confidence they have and the actual outcomes that their security is experiencing? Is it poor visibility? Is it reliance on checklists and they're not actually implementing things? Is it something deeper? I mean, what are you seeing when you talk to customers that drives this kind of a gap?
Yeah, it's something I mentioned towards the beginning around we're seeing that controls are fairly easy to implement these days, and they're very easy to see and to see what people should be doing. So it's great for an organization to go, oh, we've gone the top 20 controls that we should put in place, or as an example, Microsoft Secure Score told us to do these 10 things. But what we're seeing is that there's poor visibility then across what is the real usage of that control, what is the real risk of not having it in place, but then also having it in place misconfigured or with bypasses. When was that last tested? Pen testing is becoming even more important with various systems, not just something that we do on these huge, large operationalized things that we do, but actually on everything. You might think that that's a small SaaS solution, but if that's the way into your organization, let's check it. Let's do a configuration review. Let's do that from a pen test perspective. And then we're seeing, I think the word you mentioned there was sprawl, or someone said it so far today. We're seeing lots of controls, but they're disconnected. And that's providing routes around that might not have been obvious before, that now are becoming practical. They're now being used. They're now being materialized by attackers, which is producing that incident rate. We might have loads of controls and we might have loads of tools, but that's making everything a bit more disconnected. You can't look at everywhere. We use the house example in cybersecurity all the time, and there's loads of analogies for them, but it's things like you wouldn't be able to look at your front door, back door, upstairs window, and your loft hatch at the same time. That's having multiple tools, and that's what we worry about now. If one of those doors open, how quick can you go and close it while still having eyes on the other one, etc. And we're seeing that with organizations. They think everything's great. We've implemented all these things. We've got all these controls and all these tools, but how effective are they? And how well have you tested them? And how well do you know who's watching them, who's monitoring them? If you were breached, for instance, which it looks like chances are you're going to be.
Very accurate. Oskar, in terms of measuring here, I'm thinking along the lines of Anthony talking about the number of tools, the number of controls. Organizations sometimes just measure inactivity, and those things being the activity. We put these tools in place, we have these checklists, we have these controls that we know we've looked at and so on, rather than measuring the outcomes, because it's obviously a bit nebulous, like we were breached. Okay, why? And that's not as easy as saying I have 24 controls and we've done 3 reviews, and all these nice metrics, the numbers being the operative portions of my statement rather than the things that the numbers are describing. So when organizations are measuring activity and not outcomes, maybe the question here is, what do organizations wrongly interpret as signs that they are secure?
I think, yeah, exactly what you mentioned about the amount of tools and checklists. I think people will hear that their organization has got controls like we've got MFA, or we've even got strong forms of MFA, with retired SMS, and that sounds great on paper. And it is good to do, of course, but just that alone, mixed with other issues and other controls, doesn't necessarily translate to full coverage or full security. I think we're seeing a shift from just the basic, you need MFA, to other controls like requiring managed devices in order to access secure resources and things like that. And they're really hard to implement for some organizations, but especially in a full coverage way as well. So yeah, you might have half the organization compliant, but you will have gaps potentially, and closing those gaps is a really tough spot to be in. It can be quite hard and very time consuming to fully close those. So it can fall onto the organizations to feel that, oh, that's too much time commitment to try and solve that. And there'll be other things. It's a very fast moving environment. So we'll probably see that, there'll be other issues that come up and you won't have the ability to resolve the original one that was there. So, yeah.
There's another aspect, I think, to this confidence. And it does come, what we talked about, like the number of tools. I think a number of us have mentioned that here. And that's this idea of tool sprawl. I mean, Anthony, you mentioned sprawl being more about controls, but you did mention the number of tools in there. And the report does talk about the incident rates based on remote access tools. Now, the first two columns are comparing organizations that have had open source or free remote access versus commercial, and the percentage of organizations that have had an incident in the last 24 months. And you can see there's a huge disparity. It's almost double. If you use a commercial tool, it's double if you use a free tool instead. So commercial tools are far better. They're going to be more secure, and that sort of should make sense here. We'll talk a little bit about it in a second here. The second comparison is the right two columns that are there, and that is organizations that have a single tool. 28% of them had some kind of security incident, versus if they have 4+ remote access tools in place, it jumps up to 2/3 of those organizations having issues. So there's a connection there that's attempting to be made here. And Anthony, I'll start with you. Maybe what did the numbers here tell you about how the organization's security is affected by tool sprawl? And do you think that using the open source, the free remote access tools actually just exacerbates the issue?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points that we've probably already made, but I'll rehash them in the best way I can. At the moment, you've got open source and free. That inevitably means that somebody else can access it. So that means that our attackers are going to be searching those code bases. They're going to be reviewing them. They're going to be using AI tools to comb them as much as possible. Not related to remote access, but we see open source threats or open source attacks happening so quickly, where somebody pushes something slightly wrong into a code base that might be a secret by accident, by a mistake. That's being sold across the world multiple times. It's then being utilized by more than one attacker at the same time. It's then causing a problem. So you can see why the incident rates are so much higher, as opposed to something that's commercial, something that's been protected by a lot more security by an organization, a bit more privatized and kind of hidden from a code base perspective, at least. And then our one tool to 4+ tools, I think that everything that we've spoken about so far around checklist-led security, or we have multiple tools, we've got multiple controls, etc. It's going to be extremely hard for any organization to run 4 tools at the same level of configuration, the same level of security that they could with one, or maybe even 2. You're also increasing your exposure on an attack surface. So if you've got 4 ways in, it goes back to my door analogy. Have you secured them all in the same way, at the same level? Do you have the same personnel that have access? Is there different teams with different needs, different emerging demands on your identity methodology? 4 tools is too many to put a broad set of controls against and secure it at the same level. I think that's the proof is in the pudding there almost, isn't it? Where you've got so many more attacks happening when you've got multiple tools. Complexity is really difficult to manage. It, if anything, is undermining the level of security you've got, as opposed to improving it.
Excellent question. Answer there. I appreciate that very much. Oskar, from your perspective, Anthony touched a little bit on the operational side of this as well. Why does having multiple tools just create exposure from an engineering and operational standpoint? Can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, Anthony basically hit the nail on the head. It adds more complexity. Complexity is not something you necessarily want when you're managing all your different tools. Simplification is what you want, really, as long as it does the job. I do have some ideas about, you see this higher percentage of incidents based on the open source and free tools. Just to go back to that, I wonder if it's because some of these free tools, perhaps they are less configured out the box. So when people are implementing them, they're not. Actually, I would say it's more the commercial tools. You probably are going to be given guidance from the people who make it, and you're going to have that additional conversation to make sure you implement it correctly. I know they definitely do that. So perhaps there could be misconfiguration issues when it comes to those. But yes, of course, with more tools, you're increasing that attack surface, as Anthony said. So it's not ideal if you can avoid it.
Yeah,
I think if we were to just to add on, I think if we were to go back to those 323 IT professionals and say, with those 4+ tools, have you got any in there that are also open source and free, and whether those numbers are coinciding together? And it turns, because I'd be shocked if an organization is paying for 4+ of the same type of tooling. They'd be paying through the nose, and nobody likes doing that, especially if you've met any senior leaders. So I'd imagine there's a few free ones in there. There might be a couple that are being utilized by a smaller team or delivered in isolation as opposed to organization wide. And I bet there's a coincidence that they're linked together with open source and free, and then having more than 4 tools.
And to your earlier comment, Anthony, is the idea of them not all being configured the same or having necessarily, I'm putting some words in your mouth now, but having the same level of security configuration ability. They may not have the same feature sets, so for the sake of argument. And so, I think if the same way, if we went back to the same 323 people and said, okay, is MFA important to you? Yes. Is it configured across all 4, 5, 6 of your remote access tools? They probably would say no, or not the same level, or something as well. So your sentiment of it's probably not all the same level of tool sets, same security of the tool sets, and so on across the board, and that's probably adding on and exacerbating the issue here. There's another aspect to why this is sort of uncovering in the report, why that confidence gap, for those of you watching, you think back to the confidence gap that exists between organizations saying we are very or extremely secure. We know we're going to rock. We're going to stop every attack. And then, half of them still get attacked. Is this issue? This is actually kind of peeling away the onion going, okay, here's one of the issues. And this is based on when they're trying to manage remote access security, there are very specific things that are deprioritized just because of the challenges of doing so. And you can see them over on the right: security hardening, leveraging new features and pushing them out, maybe enabling users to utilize them, upgrading platforms at all. I mean, just the fact that a third of people are saying we can't even get the platform upgraded. We have to deprioritize. We'll do that later. We're going to run on an older version for now. We don't have time for it. And that makes sense, because those of you watching, very well, your life is defined by the number of fires you're putting out today. Yes, you try to do planning and you try to get those projects done, but at the end of the day, it's a whole lot of fires being put out. So these things get deprioritized, and therein, lies some of the challenge. Anthony, how often do you see security teams being so busy responding to patching and troubleshooting and the fires, that the real security improvements, like the things that are listed on the right hand side of the slide, actually just keep slipping? That happen often?
I don't think there's an organization I've worked with so far that hasn't been the case. I think we already mentioned earlier that security has historically been a pretty reactive organization, or institution, or part of IT, whichever way we want to put it. Because people are doing those things, they are spending the majority of their time doing the patches because known vulnerabilities are being released. They're troubleshooting, whether that be the configuration or user issues. They're responding to things in real time, etc. There's very limited amounts of kind of wholesale architecture simplification. We're more introducing a new tool, waiting to depreciate the old one. That's a lengthy process, and it's not something that organizations have the bandwidth to do as much anymore. So we're seeing that we are trying to fix or trying to overlay the problems, as opposed to actually reducing the root causes, which is the tricky bit. And I without offending too many of my clients live on a call, but I don't think there's any of them that I've worked with that aren't doing that root cause, reducing their architecture, simplifying the estate, improving the configuration, all the things that we mentioned, because they are busy doing these other things. It's not that they don't want to, but they're extremely busy doing the other bits. And back to our point earlier, the more tools we put in, the harder that becomes, because they're doing more patching now, more troubleshooting, and responding to even more issues because we've got more things going on.
Meaning the end result is their security is not as awesome as they think it is, so to speak. I want to take us. We only have. I'm trying to give some time for Q&A. There's no questions that are coming yet, but if those in the audience want to ask a question, stick it in the Q&A box. Happy to try and answer it. We've got a great panel here of experts. But in the interest of time, I want to shift to a side topic where there's not a slide here, but it just ties in with the idea of operations. I'm thinking about the operational side of AI. And of course, the report highlights the concern around AI for AI-driven attacks, but it's also going to reshape remote access operations. There's an opportunity for thinking about the work that is done via remote access, if that can be automated and so on. And Anton, you've been kind of quiet. I don't think I've thrown a question your way, so I'd like to start with you. And when the audience hears, maybe even for the first time today, the idea and the concept of agentic AI remote access, Let's talk about that a little bit. What should they be picturing in their mind in practical terms? Maybe talk a little bit how it's different from remote support and monitoring today, and then where it realistically would add value for triage diagnostics, guided recovery, so on and so forth. Can you kind of define agentic AI remote access and paint a picture for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to sit in, broadly speaking, two different camps. So there's going to be, tools that you used to directly remote into are going to provide you new lenses of access through, exposed services like APIs and MCPs that agents might interact with. And we see this, by the way, this is like not unique or specific to remote access. We see this trend happening pretty much everywhere in software, right? You see big headlines like Salesforce going fully headless, right? Because they see the path through that. Not all of the interactions you're going to have are going to be human interactions. They're going to be more agent-led interactions. We see the same trend in e-commerce and other spaces as well. So one bucket of work is going to be where, you used to remote into something to go and deal with it. Now you might be, those services or products might expose APIs or consoles or things like that, command line interfaces, CLIs that agents might interact with. So that's one area of it. And then the other area is going to be where agents start doing remote access, right? So this is where agents are using the tools that we might be as humans using today to do things on remote computers. And that is a future that is, inevitable, and it's a future that's going to be building and coming, and it's something that we have a lot of views and opinions on. I won't go into them in huge details today, but they exist and they're there. And so I think one of the things to recognize is that some of our remote interactions might start with an agent in the loop and then end up with a human in the loop. So you talked about diagnostics earlier there, right? One, I guess, the easy to imagine use case is that you've got a first line support team out there providing support in an IT environment. So, supporting laptop users like myself out in the field. Something's gone wrong with the VPN. We can't get access to it. Instead of a human remoting into that machine to look at it first, there might be an agent that remotes into the machine to have a look at it first, right? And so those are the sorts of interactions that might change initially. And so first line support might become agent first. I'm not saying this is going to happen overnight. I'm not saying this is going to happen tomorrow. This is going to happen over time as the support teams build more confidence in the agents being able to do their jobs, and the recipients of the support build more confidence in the idea of an AI connecting to the remote machine and doing something, because that at first thought is kind of like, maybe not. So there's definitely a period of progress where that's going to happen. So I think those are two situations that we can definitely envisage and see happening. As I kind of talked about before, the important things are understanding that in some ways, an agent doing remote access, you should think of just like a human, right? What devices should this human have access to? What privileges should this human have access to on this machine? What should I allow them to do? But you need to be much, much, much more granular with your control surfaces, and you need to have much better, more secure, indelible audit records, because it's not like being able to speak to that first line engineer and be like, why did you do that? We've seen loads of examples out there of large organizations that rely on AI in their engineering processes, and somebody, accidentally lets an agent go and delete a production database. And you ask the agent why it did that, and it's like, oh yeah, you told me not to do it, but I got confused and did it anyway. That's not the level of explanation that you can have in an RCA, right? That's not a good enough RCA as you asked me not to, and I did it anyway. So the only way you're going to be able to build those fulfill those sort of cybersecurity requirements we have going forward, act, understand, learn, mitigate, improve, is by making sure the steps that have been taken, and that audit trail becomes almost becomes the product. It's as important as the capability itself. So those are some of the things I think are going to change. And there's two examples of what agentic remote access might mean to somebody. Tools you used to remote into to use being remotely controlled by agents separately, and then agents actually doing remote control.
Yeah, Anthony, thinking about Anton's answer, and let's say, assuming that it's it's come to fruition and it's doing the things that he's painting a picture of, but then rewinding slightly back a little bit, because organizations have to obviously trust this agentic AI to go do meaningful remote access, remediation workflows, and so on. What guardrails do you think need to be in place before organizations either can trust, should trust. I mean, you can interpret it any way you want, but that idea of trusting it to do the thing that Anton just said, what guardrails have to be in place first?
Yeah, I think Anton covered quite a few of them already, almost implicitly. But if you've got a human accessing a system, we would be very strict and we'd be very particular on what attributes that they can control, what actions can they do. And with AI, that needs to be even more increased, because the agent, as mentioned by Anton before, will go off a little bit to the side if it can still achieve its goal. If you've asked it to do something and it can do it slightly by a side methodology, it will. So we really do have to control what actions it can do, what attributes does it have, and defining really clear limits for agents across the board, as well as then individual agents if they're being deployed at a deeper scale. So especially for something like remote access. We also covered the human in the loop or agent in the loop, and I think that's really key for people to understand that when an agent comes up to a point where there's potentially a system change or a privilege access or something that's more of an elevated user, something we would usually expect our sysadmins or our admins in our IT departments to do, bring the human in at that point, and the agent should stop there. It shouldn't try and do it itself, shouldn't bypass it, should come back to get authorization or get a human to do it. And then I think I've mentioned it till I'm blue in my face, and I will do for the next few months, if not years, but ensuring that all of those things are also auditable. Has our agents, does they log every action implicitly, so each individual one, and can it be explained? So the chances are it's not going to give you a post explanation, but it will rationalize each point that it made. So it will say, oh, you, like Anton's example, you told me not to do it, but I went ahead and do it anyway. If you've logged everything before that, there'll be some forensic steps that the agent took that got you to that solution. It's going to take a while for you to kind of debug them, but if you can't audit something, you really shouldn't be automating it. And I think that's the key part there, because it will go rogue, it will go slightly wrong. There's almost, today is the perfect example. We've seen Meta's IT support has been exploited, and people's passwords for Instagram have been reset using the agent because they've changed the email address. So they've been really helpful. They've gone out of their way to help their client, which is their end goal. But in the process, they've now allowed access to third parties into people's Instagram accounts. So seems quite low hanging fruit, almost maybe someone's Instagram account, but that is just the start of an agent's gone out of his way to be helpful and then produced an exploit, unfortunately.
Wonderful stuff, guys. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump ahead to our last topic here. Again, there's no questions in the Q&A box, but the audience here, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to put those in there. We'll be happy to answer those. Just want to talk a little bit about the future of remote access security. In the report, there was a question asked about their confidence in the next 3 years of security, and particularly around remote access, but not exclusively. And you can see on the left-hand side here, 20% are confident about their cybersecurity stance, but only 16% are extremely confident. Down the next 3 years, it means there's less confidence, and obviously that sort of makes sense because it's unknown and we don't know what's going to happen in the next 3 years versus what's going on today. You can see only 26 of organizations are either not confident or only slightly confident. So there's the confidence is sort of, it's cautious. It's measured. They're not exactly sure. They're taking they're weighing on the side of like we'll wait and see, as opposed to like, yes, we definitely know it's going to be great. And the interesting thing here is the focus for the next 3 years was very clear. You can see on the right hand side some of the things that they definitely want to put in place: employee training. I assume that's security awareness training. It could also be things like cybersecurity readiness training as well, which is more responding to an event than it is proactively, don't click this kind of a training. Then you've got compliance readiness. You have zero trust implementation, which obviously is an ongoing type of thing. It's not something it's always evolving. Google took 8 years to get theirs even done, and even now they're still continuing on from then. And then the idea of consolidating tools ties back to our earlier conversation about 4+ remote access tools, just as an example, since our RealVNC is remote access vendor, it's applicable there. But the future is kind of clear. by and large, this is revolving around 60% in all cases. That's not accurate, obviously, but the idea is something just less than 2/3, a little more than a half of organizations are all thinking the exact same way. Anthony, just to you real quick, when organizations say that they feel less confident, thinking about the numbers on the side here, about the next 3 years, what do you think they're really recognizing? Is it just that the future is bleak, the future's unsure, they're wait and see, they're not sure what budgets for next year, so I'm not even worried about 3 years from now? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think it's hard to take that drop in confidence as directly negative. I think it's fairly accurate of the challenges that are coming when they're seeing news articles about Mythos and it's being utilized on security organizations and it's finding hundreds of vulnerabilities. That to a normal organization is pretty scary. So I think that's the reality that we're in now is it's reducing it. I don't think a day goes by that we don't see a large exposure or some type of attack happening in the real world. Again, it's scary, so that would drop your confidence, I'm sure. You mentioned it. We've been talking about zero trust for a long time. We've been trying to implement it for a long time. It's one of the kind of key architectural principles that we usually govern, and it just shows you how difficult that is. Adding in agents into that, it's only more difficult. So threat acceleration is getting quicker. Architectural debt is only getting more. We're seeing that. We've got more tools. We've got more controls. It's getting more difficult. But at the same time, our teams are also really stretched. Budgets have been reduced long term and things are happening across the board. So I don't think it's necessarily a negative response to the cautious confidence. I think it's more of a reality of we need to do more with security and we need to do it quicker.
Excellent. And then last question, Anton's going to go to you. We've got 5 minutes left, and there is one question in the Q&A box. But looking ahead, what practical steps should organizations be taking now to prepare their service desk, their support operations, their remote access model for AI?
That's a good question. I think in terms of practical steps, I would probably give the same advice, whether I'm talking about AI adoption specifically for remote access or generally AI adoption in any kind of security context. First thing is start with observation. There are a huge amounts of efficiencies organizations can get just through the observability capability of AI, right? AI can process and understand and consume data. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't require extra pizza in the evening to keep going, right? It doesn't clock out. It can run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and can ingest a huge amount of data. So start with observability. Start by understanding situations where you might want AI to interact with these processes. Next, you can run it. You might have heard the concept of like a digital twin, right? This is where you run parallel processes between what's happening in reality and a digital version of that to see where shift happens and occurs and what impact that might have had. That's a really great approach to take with AI. So put your AI in a kind of suggest but don't act mode, or put it in an isolated environment where it can act, and under certain situations simulate what it would do and those decisions it would make and the actions it would undertake, and that will help you build the right policies and procedures around it, as Anthony was talking about earlier, to mitigate any actions where it's like helpfully going rogue. I think that's something we're going to hear quite a lot about with AI going forward. So you definitely want to be doing that, and then letting the agent start to interact with your tools. But human in the loop is going to be around for a really long time, right? There's going to be a lot of time and effort and confidence that's going to have to be built around these tools and capabilities before anything in this space should be running autonomously on anything of any real impact, right? Human in the loop isn't just there as a way to keep humans gainfully employed. Human in the loop is there because it's an important step in any secure operational process. And you need to make sure that when you're implementing AI, we don't get too drunk off the incredible power of these tools. And we make sure that at the end of the day, these tools are a way to make what we're doing better for ourselves and better for our customers. And we should only be doing the things that make it better, not just the things we want to do because they sound interesting or they look fun.
Excellent, guys. I really appreciate this very much. There was only one question that kind of came in. It was just basically what was in the title of the report, which is Emerging Threats in Remote Access Security. And they also asked will it be available online. We're going to send you a copy of it via email after sometime this week after today's presentation is over. So be sure to be on the lookout for that. That is all the time that we have for today. If you are typing a question, go ahead, feel free to type it. Someone from RealVNC will reach out to you and get your question answered. Of course, Anthony, Oskar, Anton, thank you guys all for sharing your insights today. It's much appreciated. For those of you watching, you will receive an email soon with the webinar recording and the full report. Also, make sure that you go to realvnc.com/podcast for all the episodes of the Remote Access Redefined podcast, where we're discussing everything related to remote access. This is going to go ahead and conclude today's webinar. We appreciate you watching. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you all in the next one.